The beacon came in on day 11. I know that because I had been logging the days. Not formally, the ship's chrono does that without my help, but I'd been writing the number at the top of each shift summary for about 3 weeks running, ever since we crossed the Vethani Drift and lost the relay buoys. When you're in the dead space between coalition nodes, you log things manually. You keep track. It's not a regulation. It's just what you do when you are 11 days from the nearest resupply point, and your crew of 42 is the only human presence in a volume of space roughly the size of a small star system. 11 days. The beacon was weak. Carrier-class distress, galactic standard encoding, the kind any species in the Concordat had been using for about 200 years. My comms officer, Petty Officer Lin, flagged it on the secondary board because it wasn't strong enough to trigger the primary alert threshold. She brought it to me in person, which meant she'd already decided it mattered. Coalition routing tag on the relay header, she said, setting her tablet on the chart table. Classified non-priority, forwarded to the Durathi Cluster Relief Authority 8 days ago. No response logged. I looked at the header, non-priority. I'd seen that classification before. It meant the coalition had received the signal, acknowledged it, assigned it a case number, and moved on to whatever they considered more pressing. The case number was proof the system had functioned. The absence of a response was not, in the coalition's accounting, a failure. It was a resource allocation decision. I looked at the coordinates. The signal was coming from a moon called Korrath, listed in the Concordat Navigational Registry as a low-gravity extraction satellite, primary resource designation Trisonite ore, secondary designation industrial ceramite. Administered under charter by the Saurai people, who were listed as a Class III Concordat affiliate, which meant they had observer status at the Council but no fleet representation and no military treaty. They had been mining Korrath for, according to the registry notes, approximately 600 years. Their population on the station was listed at 4,300. 4,300 people. The beacon had been running for 11 days. "What's our diversion cost?" I asked Lynn. She'd already calculated it. She always had. 31 hours to Korrath, 31 hours back. Add 62 hours to the Vethani delivery window. We'd need to file an amended manifest. "Pull the Korrath charts," I said. "I'll file the amendment." She didn't ask why. She picked up her tablet and went back to her station. I went to my bunk and wrote the amendment in about 4 minutes, flagged it to Logistics Command with a brief explanatory note, distress beacon, non-priority coalition routing, diverting to investigate, and sent it before I could second-guess the math. Logistics Command would receive it in about 6 hours. By then we'd already be pointed at Korrath. That's how it starts most of the time, not with a speech. Not with a decision that feels heroic in the moment. You see the number. You run the calculation. You file the paperwork. The heroism, if there is any, is entirely administrative. We turned the ESV, Relentless Meridian, around at 3:47 ship time, and I went to sleep. I should tell you about the ship, because she matters to what follows. The Relentless Meridian was a Cressida-class logistics frigate, hull number LF7 in the Earth Stellar Volunteer Registry, commissioned 22 years ago and refitted twice since. She was not a warship, though she carried the equipment and crew complement of a light combat vessel, because the Vethani Drift was not a safe supply route, and the ESV didn't send unarmed ships into unsecured space. She had 2 rail guns, 4 point defense clusters, and enough hardened cargo space to carry field equipment for a forward operating base. She was also, by the reckoning of most of the officers who'd served on newer hulls, somewhat elderly. Her refit had brought her systems current, but you could feel the age in her, in the way the ventilation groaned when the gravity compensators cycled, in the particular harmonic the starboard engine made at 3/4 thrust, in the way the lighting in the aft corridor had always been slightly yellower than the forward sections, and no one had ever quite fixed it. I had been on her for 4 years. I knew every sound she made. My crew were not specialists in humanitarian response. They were a logistics crew, a supply-run crew, the kind of people who spent their careers moving equipment and materials across unglamorous distances. We had a field trauma team of 6 standard complement for a vessel operating without nearby medical support, and a combat engineering platoon of 12 under Staff Sergeant Aldrich Hassel, who had been with the ship longer than I had, and who had, in my estimation, forgotten more about structural field repair than most engineers ever learned. The rest were deck crew, systems technicians, comms, and navigation ratings. Nobody had briefed us on Sarai sociology or Korrath's internal situation. Nobody had time to. Len spent the 31 hours pulling everything the Concordat registry had on the Sarai and building me a summary. She was thorough. By the time Korrath appeared on our forward sensors, I knew the broad outline. A 600-year mining operation, a 3-caste social structure, a long-standing charter relationship with the Durathi extraction guilds that had in recent years become something other than cooperative. I knew that the Sarai or speakers, their administrative and spiritual leadership, had been in negotiation with the Durathi Guild authority over extraction quotas for 3 years, and that the negotiations had stalled. I knew that tritonite ore, which the Sarai mined, had become significantly more valuable in the past 18 months because of its use in coalition drive systems, and that this had changed the dynamic of the charter relationship in ways that the Sarai had not benefited from. I knew that the beacon had been running for 11 days and that no one had come. What I didn't know, what the registry couldn't tell me, was what we were going to find. Korrath from high orbit was the color of old bone. It was a low-gravity world, which meant the surface was pocked and irregular, and the extraction platforms were large horizontal structures built to compensate for the lack of atmospheric pressure in the upper regions. Delve Station Korrath was the largest of these, a platform roughly 3 kilometers across, built into and over a natural rock formation that gave it some shelter from the micrometeorite environment. From orbit, it looked like a gray dish pressed against the pale surface. And it looked, from our sensor readings, like it was in trouble. Partial power across the main grid, my systems officer, Ensign Tevar, reported. Atmospheric processing running at about 60%. I'm reading thermal signatures consistent with a number of personnel concentrated in the central hab block. The outer work sections look cold. Ships. 2, Len said. Durathi Registry. 1 is a medium capacity or freighter sitting at the primary docking arm. The other is a class I can't immediately identify, heavier displacement, non-standard configuration, sitting at about 200 kilometers altitude, equatorial hold. I looked at that for a moment. An unidentified heavy displacement vessel sitting above a distress station whose coalition relief request had been classified non-priority. Get me a channel to the station, I said. It took 4 minutes to establish contact. When the Korrath comm operator answered, she spoke in Concordat standard with an accent I hadn't heard before. The Sarai inflection, I later learned, puts a slight resonant undertone on vowels, as though the speaker's voice comes from slightly deeper in the chest than a human's. It's not unpleasant. It's just distinctly not human, and it reminded me, usefully, that I was about to walk into a situation I understood only partially. This is LT. Commander Ashad Dreven, ESV Relentless Meridian, Earth Stellar Volunteer Logistics Registry, I said. We received your distress beacon 11 days ago via coalition relay. We've diverted from a scheduled supply run. What is your current status? A pause, longer than signal lag accounted for. You are Earth vessel. Yes. Another pause, I waited. We sent the beacon to the coalition. We were told, we received a case number. We were told a relief assessment would be conducted. I'm aware, I said. We're not a coalition relief vessel. We're a logistics frigate on a supply run. We picked up the beacon and diverted. I'd like to know your current situation before we attempt to dock. The pause this time was very long, long enough that I began to wonder if the comm had dropped. Then please come, please come. That was enough. I assembled the department heads in the briefing room, Hassel, Len, Tevar, and Dr. Emeth, my senior medical officer. Len put up what she had on the main screen, the Dorathi Guild situation, the power grid partial failure, the unidentified heavy ship, the population concentration in the central hab. Guild freighter at the docking arm means they haven't left, Hassel said. He was a compact, quiet man, the kind of engineer who spoke mostly in observations rather than opinions, and whose observations tended to be accurate. Could be waiting on cargo. Could be something else. The heavy displacement ship at altitude concerns me more, I said. Guild enforcement, Hassel said, not a question. Possibly, we'll know more when we're down there. I looked at the table. Dr. Emeth, I want your trauma team ready to go to work the moment we're on the ground. Prioritize whatever the station medical situation is. Hassel, I want your engineers in 2 groups, one to assess the power grid, one to go where I need them when I figure out what else we're dealing with. Len, I want continuous monitoring on that heavy ship. The moment it moves or does anything, I want to know. Nobody asked if we were sure about this. That's the thing about a crew that has been together long enough. They've already made the calculation themselves, and the calculation came out the same way yours did. We began our descent toward Korrath at 6:14 ship time. The relentless Meridian was not a planetary lander. She was too large for that, but she had 2 drop shuttles, and I took the larger of the 2 down with Hassel's engineers, Dr. Emeth's trauma team, and 4 deck crew. We came in over the pale surface of the moon at low altitude, which let me see the station clearly as we approached. From the ground, Delve Station Korrath looked exhausted. That's the only word for it. The outer sections of the platform, the work decks, the ore processing bays, the equipment storage wings were dark and still. Several of the outer dock connections were clearly retracted or damaged. I could see the articulated arms hanging at wrong angles, like fingers that had been bent and left that way. The central hab block was lit, but unevenly. Some sections were bright, others dim, and the atmospheric venting ports along the eastern edge were putting out a gray mist that suggested the filtration system was working harder than it should have been. We put down on the primary landing pad at 6:41. It was a large pad, built to handle the weight of an ore freighter, and the Dorathi Guild freighter was parked about 300 meters to our west, its cargo doors closed, its running lights on but dim. They met us at the bottom of the shuttle ramp. There were 9 of them, and they were nothing like anything I'd encountered in 4 years of ESV logistics runs, which had taken me to 11 different species-held systems, and through more council depot stations than I could count. The Sauri were smaller than I'd expected from the registry notation, bipedal, but low-slung in their posture, with the slightly compressed build you see in species that evolved in low gravity and spent generations in environments that made height a liability. They were copper-furred, every one of them, though the fur varied in shade from a bright new coin color in the youngest to a dull, burnished reddish-brown in the oldest. They had 6 limbs, 2 primary arms at the shoulder level, 2 secondary arms lower on the torso that in most of the adults I saw that day were partly folded in a way that suggested they were not needed for immediate activity, and 2 legs. Their faces were broad and flat with large amber eyes that reflected light slightly differently than primate eyes do, picking up the ambient glow of the landing pad and throwing it back with a faint gold sheen. The 9 of them stood at the base of the ramp and looked up at us. I came down first. Hassel was behind me, and behind him the engineers and the trauma team in 2 distinct groups, the engineers in work gear, the medics in the lighter gray of ESV Medical. I stopped at the bottom of the ramp, close enough to be heard clearly, and I looked at the group. There was a woman at the front. She was older, her fur was the burnished color, worn thin in patches at her face and along her secondary arms, and she wore the layered robe and panel configuration that Len's summary had identified as the dress of the Or speakers. She was looking at me with an expression I didn't have a reference for yet. I learned to read Sarai expressions over the course of that day, and I later understood what I was seeing in that first moment. She was trying to hold herself very still in the way people do when they are afraid that any movement might break something fragile. "I am Or speaker Veth Kanara," she said. Her Concordat standard was precise and careful, the kind of precision that comes from having learned a language formally rather than colloquially. "I am the senior administrator of Delve Station Korrath. Are you the captain of the Earth vessel?" "Logistics officer," I said. "LT, Commander Ashadrevan, close enough." She looked at me. Then she looked at the group behind me, at the engineers in their work gear, at the medics with their equipment cases, at Hassel standing with his arms slightly out from his sides in the posture he always adopted when he was assessing a structural situation, which meant he was already looking at the station rather than at the reception party. "How many of you are there?" Veth Kanara asked. 31 on the ground. 11 aboard the Meridian in orbit." She was quiet for a moment. I couldn't tell if that was more or fewer than she'd hoped for. She said, carefully, "We have 914 people in the central hab. The outer sections have been sealed because we do not have sufficient power to maintain atmosphere there. There are wounded. The Delvekin, the workers, some of them tried to continue operating the ore processing machinery when the power grid began to fail. 3 days ago, the eastern grid section collapsed entirely. 12 workers were in the processing bay when it happened." "Are they still there?" "The ones who could be moved are in the medical center. 3 could not be moved safely. They have been," she paused, selecting a word, "attended to as best we can, but our medical officer says they need equipment we don't have." I turned to Dr. Emeth without having to think about it. He was already looking at me. "Medical center first," I said. He nodded, and Emeth and his team were moving before I'd finished the sentence. Veth Kanara gestured to one of the younger Sarai behind her, who stepped forward immediately to guide them. "The power grid," I said to Hassel. "Yeah," he said, which was Hassel's way of saying he'd already identified it as the first thing that needed addressing. "Can someone take me to the primary distribution node?" Another of the Sarai stepped forward. Hassel looked at me briefly, and I gave him the nod, and he and 4 of his engineers followed their guide into the station interior without ceremony. That left me, 6 deck crew, and Veth Kanara on the landing pad. I looked at her. I looked at the closed Durathi freighter 300 meters away. I looked up at the amber sky, which was the particular pale color of a low-atmosphere moon in its star's late morning position, a color that I kept thinking illogically looked like something you'd describe as unhealthy, though I couldn't have said why. And I said, "Walk me through the situation, all of it. Start with the guild freighter." She did. The charter relationship between the Sarai and the Durathi extraction guilds was not, Veth Kanara explained as we walked the perimeter of the landing pad, a simple employment arrangement. The Durathi held the processing and export licenses for the tritonite ore that the Sarai mined. The Sarai held the mining rights and provided the labor. The revenue was split under a formula that had been negotiated 160 years ago, and had not been substantially revised since, despite the fact that tritonite had become, in the past 18 months, worth approximately 4 times what it had been worth when the most recent minor revision to the formula was made. The Durathi Guild representatives had come to Korrath 6 weeks ago with a new proposal. The proposal, as Veth Kanara described it in her careful, formal Concordat standard, was structured in a way that would have increased the guild's extraction volume by 60%, while reducing the Sarai's revenue share from 32% to 11%, with a clause that would have transferred the legal administration of Delve Station Korrath itself to the guild authority within 5 years. The Orspeaker Council had declined. The Dorathi Guild freighter had remained. "They are waiting," Vethkanara said. We had stopped walking. We were standing near the eastern edge of the landing pad from which you could see the dark outer work sections of the station, the sealed bays, the retracted dock arms, the still processing machinery. "They believe we will accept the terms when the situation becomes sufficiently difficult." "And the power grid failure?" She was quiet for a moment. "The grid failure was not deliberately caused. Our grid maintenance staff has been reduced over the past 8 months. 4 of our senior technicians left when the negotiation began to fail. They were Dorathi-affiliated technical staff. When they left, they took the maintenance documentation with them." I absorbed that. "The ship at altitude," I said. "Guild Enforcement Authority," she said, simply. No anger in her voice, no accusation, just the flat delivery of information that had already been processed through whatever filter she'd needed to apply to it to keep functioning. "They arrived 4 days after the freighter. They have not communicated with us directly. They communicated with the freighter captain, and the freighter captain told our council that the Enforcement Authority vessel was present in a monitoring capacity. In case you tried to send ore out without guild processing authorization," I said. "Yes." I looked at the sky again. The enforcement vessel was up there somewhere, 200 kilometers above us, watching. It had watched for 11 days. It had watched while the power grid failed and the workers were injured and the outer sections were sealed, and 4,300 people, 914 of them now crowded into the central hab, had a beacon running that the coalition had categorized as non-priority. I went back inside and found a quiet corner of the station's administrative block, and I called the Meridian. "Lend. Commander. The ship at altitude. What can you tell me about it?" A pause while she pulled data. "Hull configuration matches a class used by several guild enforcement authorities in the Dorathosauri corridor. Displacement suggests it's carrying about 60 personnel, light armament, point defense, and 1 forward rail mount. Not a warship, not configured for combat operations. But configured to look like it might be." "Yes, Commander." I thought about that for a moment. Keep her on the board. Flag me if she changes position or arms anything. "Understood." I put the comm away and went to find Hassel. He was in the primary power distribution node, which was a large chamber in the lower level of the station's technical block, and he was doing the thing he always did in a new technical environment, which was standing very still in the middle of the room and looking at everything without touching anything. 2 of his engineers were beside him. The Sarai technician who had guided them was watching from the doorway, his secondary arms completely unfolded now, which I had begun to understand was a posture of anxiety. In the Sarai, the lower limbs folded when they were calm and unfolded when they were not. "Well," I said. "It's repairable," Hassel said, which from him was a significant statement. He didn't say things were repairable, unless he had already traced the problem and identified the solution in rough outline. "What's the situation?" He pointed. The power distribution node was an older installation. The registry had said the station was 600 years old, and while it had clearly been updated over the centuries, the underlying architecture was original, which meant it was built to last rather than built to be easily serviced. The eastern grid section had failed 3 days ago, and the failure mode, Hassel explained without looking away from the equipment he was examining, was what he called a thermal cascade. The insulation on 3 high-load conduit runs had degraded, likely over years, and when the load shifted following the departure of the Dorathi-affiliated maintenance technicians, The remaining system had been pushed past the thermal tolerance of the degraded sections. The eastern section had failed. The rest of the grid had compensated by load shifting, which had stressed the secondary systems and reduced the overall capacity to roughly 60%. The eastern section isn't coming back without new conduit runs, Hassel said. We don't have that material on the shuttle. But the secondary system stress I can address. If we redistribute the load more intelligently, take some of the non-essential draws completely offline and balance the remaining load across the healthy conduit runs, I think I can get them to about 75, maybe 80% capacity. Enough to restore full atmosphere to the central hab and maybe one of the inner work sections. Time. 4 hours, he said. Maybe 5. Do it. The Sarai technician in the doorway, his name was Korrath Vel. I learned later, one of the Delvkin, a young man who had been maintaining the station's systems with no formal training and whatever documentation he could find since the Dorathi technicians had left, was watching Hassel with an expression I was beginning to be able to read. Careful attention, the look of someone trying to understand a process they haven't seen before because they know they'll need to understand it later. Hassel noticed. He was not an expressive man, but he noticed things. Come here, Hassel said to him, not a command, more like an invitation. The Sarai technician came forward and Hassel started explaining what he was doing, not simplified, not patronizing. Just the technical explanation, step by step, with the specific vocabulary, the way you'd explain it to a colleague who happened to be unfamiliar with the particular system. I left them to it and went to find Dr. Emeth. The medical center was in the central hab block, and it was not, by any standard, an adequate medical facility for 914 people under stress. It had been designed for routine occupational care, injuries, minor illness, the kind of acute care you need on an industrial platform, and it had 20 beds. 11 of them were occupied when we arrived. Emeth had already triaged the room by the time I got there, and he walked me through the situation briskly, the way he always did, without editorializing. 3 of the patients were the workers who had been injured when the eastern grid section collapsed. 2 had serious thermal injuries to their secondary arms. 1 had a structural injury to her torso that Emeth described with technical precision, and that I understood to mean she was in serious trouble without intervention. The other 8 were patients who had been in the medical center before the grid failure for various reasons, 3 of whom needed medications that the station had run out of. The 3 from the collapse, Emeth said. The one with the structural injury I need to operate. I've already started prepping. The other 2 I can manage with what I brought. Do what you need to do. I need a space that's clean and powered. The operating theater here is on the eastern grid. It's dark. I looked at him, he looked at me. I'll get you power, I said. I went back to Hassel and told him what Emeth needed. Hassel walked with me to the operating theater, assessed the power requirements in about 3 minutes, and ran a direct line from the emergency generator we'd brought on the shuttle. The theater lights came on. Emeth nodded once and started unpacking his surgical kit. I left him to his work and kept moving. The central hab block was crowded with Sarai, who had been living in a reduced space for 11 days. They were orderly. The Speaker administration had organized the space into sections, with designated areas for sleeping, eating, and children. But orderly is different from comfortable, and it is very different from secure. As I moved through the hab, people watched me. They watched the ESV insignia on my jacket. They watched the deck crew behind me. Some of them were the copper-bright color of the young, and some were the burnished red-brown of the old, and some were children who came up to my waist and who had fur that was still faintly spotted, a juvenile pattern, fading at the edges as they grew into their adult coloring. None of them said anything to me directly. They watched. One of the things I noticed, moving through the hab, was how quiet it was. Not silent, There was the ambient noise of 900 people in a contained space, the sounds of breathing and movement, and the low murmur of conversation, but quieter than you'd expect. The Sarai were not a loud people in my limited experience, and whatever noise they made naturally, 11 days of crisis had brought them lower still. The children were quiet in the way children get when the adults around them are managing something that hasn't been explained to them, which is a specific quality of quiet that's worse than ordinary silence. I went back to Vethkinara. I found her in the administrative block, in a room that served as the Speaker Council chamber. A round table, 6 chairs, maps of the extraction shafts on the walls, a window that looked out onto the now dark outer work deck. She was standing at the window when I came in, looking out at the equipment that wasn't running. "The guild freighter captain," I said. "What's his name?" She turned Dras Oveth. "Has he indicated any willingness to negotiate?" "He has indicated that the terms of the new proposal are final, that there is no negotiation." She paused. "He has also indicated that the Enforcement Authority vessel would ensure that no ore left Korrath without guild processing authorization." Which is how he explained that the monitoring vessel was relevant. "Right," I said. "I'd like to speak to him." She looked at me for a moment. "He won't be." "I know," I said. "I'd like to speak to him anyway." She gestured me to a communications console on the far wall. I sat down, pulled up the channel routing, and opened a direct link to the Durathi Guild freighter. It took a few minutes for Dras Oveth to respond. When he did, his face on the comm screen was the flat non-expression of someone who has been in negotiating positions long enough to default to neutral. He was a heavy-built being with gray-blue skin and the layered pupil structure of a Durathi, which gave his eyes a slightly unfocused quality that was misleading. The Durathi, from what I'd read, were good at precise calculation behind that diffuse gaze. He looked at me. Then he said in very precise Concordat standard, "You are the Earth vessel." "ESV Relentless Meridian," I said. "LT, Commander Dreven." "What is your purpose at Delve Station Korrath?" "Humanitarian assist," I said. "We picked up the distress beacon. We've diverted from our supply run to render assistance." A pause. Oveth was calculating. I could see it. He was a negotiator. And a new variable in the situation was information to be assessed. "The coalition classified the beacon non-priority," he said. "Yes," I said, "they did." "Earth acted independently." "We filed an amended manifest," I said. "It's in the coalition logistics record. We're a registered volunteer logistics vessel. We have the operational authority to respond to distress calls independently." I let that sit for a moment. "I'm not here about the extraction charter. That's between you and the Speaker Council, and I have neither the authority nor the interest to intervene in that negotiation. I'm here because 914 people have been in a degraded habitat for 11 days. 3 of them are seriously injured, and the station's power grid is partially failed." Oveth looked at me. "We are rendering medical assistance and engineering support," I continued. "Our surgeon is currently operating on a critically injured patient. Our engineers are addressing the power grid failure. When the medical situation is stabilized and the power grid is restored to safe operating capacity, we will file our after-action report and return to our supply route." I paused. "I don't anticipate that taking more than 36 hours. Another pause. Oveth was still calculating. I waited. "The monitoring vessel's presence," he said carefully, "should not be interpreted as—" "I haven't interpreted it as anything," I said. "It's a ship at altitude. We're a ship on the ground. We're not interested in it." I looked directly at the comm pickup. "One thing I do want to be clear about, freighter captain. My ship in orbit has current sensor readings on your monitoring vessel. If anything about its status changes, if it arms, if it closes to a lower altitude, if it takes any action that could be characterized as a threat to this station or to my people on the ground, I will log it. In detail. And that log will go to the Coalition Humanitarian Registry, the ESV Command Authority, and the Korrath Press Bureau. The words were not a threat. They were true statements, offered in the tone I might use to describe how the fuel consumption calculations would work for the return trip. They were administrative facts. Oveth looked at me for a long moment. I trust that won't be necessary, he said. Me too, I said. Good doing business. I closed the channel. Veth Kanara was standing behind me. I turned. He won't interfere, I said. He's a guild enforcement operation, not a military one. They're structured around economic leverage, not direct action. Logging a humanitarian assist mission on the Korrath public record doesn't help them, and interfering with one would create problems they don't want. I stood up. The enforcement vessel will stay where it is and watch, because that's what it was deployed to do, and because withdrawing it now would look like weakness. But it won't do anything. Veth Kanara was looking at me with the expression she'd had on the landing pad, the careful stillness. But something in it had shifted slightly. I couldn't have named it precisely in that moment. How did you know? She asked. I didn't, I said. But the calculation was better odds than the alternative. I left the administrative block and went to check on Hassel. He had been working for 2 hours by then, and the engineering section had become a particular kind of organized chaos that I recognized as Hassel's operational mode. Equipment cases open in specific configurations. Cable runs laid out in patterns that looked haphazard and were extremely deliberate. 3 of his engineers working on 3 distinct tasks simultaneously. Korrath Vel was working beside one of the engineers, and from what I could see, he was following instructions and applying them correctly, which meant Hassel had been teaching while working, which was the kind of multitasking Hassel made look easy. 2 hours, Hassel said without looking up. He had a diagnostic tablet in one hand, and was running his fingers along a conduit junction with the other in a way that looked like he was reading it by touch. 2 hours to what? 78% grid capacity, maybe 80. I found a secondary redundancy loop that the original builders put in. It's 600 years old, but it's been sitting dormant, and the insulation is intact. If I can route around the failed eastern section and tie in the redundancy loop, we pick up another 12 to 15%. Korrath here found it in the original station schematics. He glanced briefly at Korrath Vel, who was doing something precise and careful with a junction tool. Good instinct for documentation, that one. Korrath Vel's secondary arms moved in a way that I later learned was the sorry equivalent of a slight nod of acknowledgement, a small motion, diffident. Do it, I said to Hassel. To Korrath Vel I said, you're doing good work. His amber eyes met mine briefly. He didn't say anything, but his secondary arms moved again in that small acknowledging way. I went to find food. The central hab had a communal area where the station's food stores were being distributed. I ate with my deck crew, ration packs, which were what we'd brought, and some of the Sarai who were working the distribution sat near us in the way that people who are exhausted and curious sometimes sit near new people, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough to make it clear they're aware of each other. One of them was a child, a girl, maybe 8 or 9 years old in whatever Sarai developmental timeline meant, small, bright copper, with the spotted juvenile fur that was mostly faded at the edges of her face. She watched my deck crew with the level unblinking, regard that children direct at things they find strange and interesting. One of my crew, Abel Spacer Thatch, a young woman from my cargo section who was the youngest person on the ship, noticed her watching, and did what Thatch usually did with a new situation, which was lean forward and say something. Hi. The child looked at her. I'm Thatch, Thatch said. The child said something in Sarai, not in Korrath standard, and then apparently decided to try the standard herself because she said, Thatch. Yeah, Thatch said, that's me. They looked at each other for a moment. Then the child said very precisely, "Why are you here?" Thatch blinked. "We picked up your signal." The child seemed to consider this. "We sent the signal 11 days ago." "I know," Thatch said. "We were far away." Another consideration. "No one else came." Thatch looked at me briefly, not for guidance, just the reflex of someone who doesn't want to answer that question inaccurately. I kept eating. "No," Thatch said, "just us." The child looked at Thatch for a moment longer. Then she looked at the floor, which I learned was a sarai thinking posture. The eyes go down when a sarai is processing something significant. "Why?" she said. Thatch opened her mouth and then closed it. It was, in fairness, not a simple question. "Because we could," Thatch said finally. "We were the closest, so." The child looked up. She was looking at Thatch with a very direct gaze. "Will you come back?" she asked. "If we send the signal again?" Thatch looked at me again. This time it was for guidance. "We'll be in this sector for the next 3 months," I said. "If the beacon goes up, we'll hear it." The child looked at me with the same direct regard she'd given Thatch. "You're very small," she said to Thatch. Thatch blinked. "What?" "Your ship, one ship." The child appeared to be working through something. "Is that normal, one ship?" "For us, yeah," Thatch said. "Usually." The child looked at the floor again. Then she said something in Sarai quietly, in the way people say something that they're processing rather than communicating. I didn't have the language. I never learned what it was. Hassel come me 4 hours later. "We're at 79% grid capacity," he said. "The redundancy loop is holding. If we bring the eastern work section atmosphere back online, we'll drop to about 68, which is stable. Or I can leave the eastern section sealed and they'll maintain near full capacity in the central hab." "Ask Veth Kenara," I said. It turned out to be a decision with implications I hadn't considered, because Veth Kenara convened the other members of the Speaker Council. There were 4 of them. One had been unavailable until now because she was one of the injured workers, and they discussed the question of the eastern section. The eastern section was where most of the ore processing machinery was. Restoring atmosphere there, even at reduced grid capacity, meant the Delvkin could potentially return to work, which meant operational continuity, which, in the calculus of the negotiation with the Guild, was significant. "We want the eastern section restored," Veth Kenara said, when the council had finished their discussion. Hassel nodded when I passed this to him. "Give me another 40 minutes. It took 35. When the atmosphere came back in the eastern section, some of the Delvkin went in. Not to start the machinery, that would take longer, and there were safety assessments needed first, but to look at it. To be in their work section again. I didn't observe this directly, but one of my deck crew who was stationed at the eastern section junction came back and reported it in the brief way people report things that have affected them slightly more than they expected. "They just walked in," she said, "and then they just stood there, looking at the machines." Dr. Emeth came to find me late in the afternoon. The moon's light cycle was longer than an Earth day, and the amber sky had shifted through several tones as the local star moved to report on the surgical patient. "She's stable," he said. "It was close, but we got there." He looked tired, which for Emeth meant the lines around his eyes were slightly more pronounced than usual, since he was not a man who showed fatigue easily. "The other 2 from the collapse are going to be fine. The medication cases I've addressed with what we have. I've left a 2-week supply from our ship's stock for the 3 patients who needed drugs we had on hand." "Good work," I said. He nodded once and went back to the medical center to monitor the recovery cases. I found Veth Kenara in the administrative block again, at the round table this time with 2 other speakers, looking at a document on the table's display surface. She looked up when I came in. "How are your people?" she asked. I was slightly surprised by the question, not because it was unexpected, but because she asked it before I could ask the same of her. "Fine," I said. "Everyone's fine." She nodded, then she said, "The patient who was operated on. She will recover." "Yes," I said. Veth Kanara looked at the table for a moment. "Her name is Dareth Sho. She has been in the Delvkin for 30 years. She was training her younger sister to take over her section when the grid failed." A pause. "Her sister is 12. I let that sit. "She'll be able to go back to work," I said. "In time, the surgeon said a few months." Veth Kanara was quiet for a moment. "I have a question," she said. "Go ahead." "Why did you come?" She said it carefully, and I understood from the care that it wasn't a challenge and wasn't ingratitude. It was a genuine inquiry. "You are a supply vessel. This is not your route. The coalition classified us non-priority. You could have continued." I thought about how to answer that. "We were the closest ship," I said. "The coalition relay had the beacon flagged but no response dispatched. When you're the closest ship and there's a beacon running with no response, you divert." I paused. "It's not complicated." She looked at me. "For us it is complicated," she said. "We sent the beacon believing that the coalition would respond. When the coalition classified us non-priority, we had certain beliefs about what that meant, about what the structure of the Concordat means and what our status within it means, and what that implies about who will respond to us when we need it." She paused. "We were recalibrating those beliefs when you arrived." I didn't say anything for a moment. "The coalition is large," I said eventually. "It processes a lot of signals. It doesn't always. It allocates resources by formula, and the formula isn't always right." I looked at the maps of the extraction shafts on the walls. "We're not coalition. We're ESV, Earth Stellar Volunteer. We're a logistics registry, not a military or a relief authority. We go where the run takes us and we divert when we should divert. That's the job." Veth Kanara was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Your engineer, Hassel." "Yes. He has been explaining the redundancy systems to Korrath Vel for 3 hours. Not superficially, in depth, as though Korrath Vel were a colleague." "That's how Hassel works," I said. "Korrath Vel has been maintaining these systems with no formal training since our Durathi technicians departed," she said. "He is 23 years old. He was a processing floor supervisor 8 months ago. He taught himself maintenance from whatever documentation he could find." She paused. "Your engineer is treating him as a technical equal." "Hassel treats anyone who knows what they're doing as a technical equal," I said. "Apparently Korrath Vel knows what he's doing." Veth Kanara looked at me for a moment. "Yes," she said, "he does." We arranged the handover of the medical supply allocation with the station medical officer, who was a quiet Sarai man of middle age who accepted the 2-week supply with a precision that suggested he was already planning how to extend it further. Hassel spent an additional 2 hours with Korrath Vel documenting the changes to the power distribution configuration in a format that Korrath Vel could maintain going forward. My deck crew helped the Sarai Habitat Management team reconfigure the central hab layout now that the eastern section was pressurized again. Less crowded, more room to breathe. Late in the evening of the first day, I walked the outer perimeter of the landing pad and calmed the meridian. "Update," I said. "The enforcement vessel has maintained its position," Len said. "No movement, no change in emission signature. The Guild freighter has powered up its secondary systems twice, once about 4 hours ago, once about an hour ago, but no engine output change. Probably just running diagnostics. Nothing that looks like preparation for departure or any other action." "Good," I said. "We'll be down here through tomorrow morning. Keep watching." "Understood, Commander." I stood on the landing pad for a while after that, looking up at the amber-dark sky. The moon had no significant atmosphere, and the star had set, which meant the sky was almost black at zenith, with the planet the moon orbited making a large pale disk in the east. Not a dramatic view, not the kind of thing that shows up in navigation registries as a tourist note, but there was something in the stillness of it that I found worth standing in for a few minutes. One ship, the child had said, "Is that normal?" For us, yeah, usually. I thought about the coalition case number. I thought about the formula the coalition used to allocate resources, and about the way a formula works, how it's designed to optimize across many situations simultaneously, and how, in doing so, it necessarily produces outcomes that feel wrong in specific cases because the formula is built for the average, and this situation was not the average. I didn't think the coalition was malicious. I thought they were running a large system with a lot of inputs, and that Korrath, from the formula's perspective, had not looked urgent enough to trigger a response. From the ground, it had felt urgent enough. That was the gap. That was always the gap. I went back inside and slept for 5 hours on a borrowed cot in the station administrative block, which was the best sleep I'd had in a week. The second day was quieter. The eastern section was fully operational by mid-morning, not the ore processing machinery, which would need a formal safety assessment before it could run, but the life systems and the workspace itself. And some of the Delvekin were already moving through it in a purposeful way that suggested they were planning the safety assessment themselves, documenting what needed to be done. Korrath Vel moved between the engineering section and the eastern section, with the focused energy of someone who has been handed a problem they understand and the tools to address it. He checked in with Hassel twice, showing him readings on a tablet, and Hassel looked at them and said things that Korrath Vel wrote down. The 3 grid collapse patients were stable. The broader patient population in the medical center was stable. Dr. Emath was running a clinic out of the medical center's waiting area for minor issues, the kind of deferred care that tends to accumulate in a population that's been stressed and managing a crisis, and not seeking treatment for anything that wasn't acute. He had a line. The line moved steadily. I spent much of the second day on logistics, coordinating with Len on the revised supply manifest, documenting the activities for the after-action report, and having a series of brief technical conversations with Hassel about what the power grid situation would look like in 6 months without intervention, and what the Sarai would need to address it properly. The answer was conduit material and a few components that weren't available on Korrath, but were available at the nearest supply depot, which was 3 weeks' travel from Korrath at freight speed. Hassel made a list. I added it to the after-action report. On the second afternoon, Veth Kenara told me that the Ore Speaker Council had decided to formally reject the Durathi Guild proposal. They had been going to reject it regardless, she said. The crisis had not changed their position, but they were going to file the rejection through the Concordat commercial arbitration system rather than directly with the Guild, which would create a formal record and bring the matter under Concordat commercial law. This had been their legal option throughout the negotiation, but they had hesitated to use it because the Durathi Guild had informal influence over several of the Concordat arbitration panel seats, and the outcome was uncertain. "We've decided the uncertainty is preferable to the alternative," she said. "And, a slight pause, your presence here has been logged in the humanitarian registry, as has the enforcement vessel's presence. That log is part of the Concordat public record. It will be available to arbitration panels." I thought about that. "I didn't log the enforcement vessel to help your arbitration," I said. "I know," she said, "but it will." I finished the after-action report that evening. 26 pages, documenting the beacon, the diversion authorization, the medical and engineering activities, the patient outcomes, the power grid restoration summary, and the coordination with the Guild freighter captain. I noted the enforcement vessel's presence and its behavior throughout our stay. I noted the materials the Sarai would need for full grid restoration and where they could be sourced. I noted the current health status of the patient population. I categorized the incident as humanitarian assist, standard diversion, and filed it to Logistics Command, the Coalition Humanitarian Registry, and the ESV Operational Archive. 26 pages for 31 hours of work by 42 people on a moon that the coalition had classified non-priority. We departed Delve Station Korrath at 8:23 ship time on the second day. The Sara who were not working or in the medical center came to the landing pad. They stood in groups, the oar speakers in their layered robes, the Delvekin in their work clothing, the shield caste survivors in the formal military dress that I understood was reserved for significant occasions. The children stood with their families. The copper fur caught the early morning amber light in a way that made them look like they were made of something warm and old and particular to this place. My crew loaded the shuttle. I made a final circuit of the medical center to check with Emeth and say goodbye to the medical staff. I stopped in the engineering section to find Hassel, who was doing a final check of the distribution node with Orthvel beside him, the two of them talking in the quiet technical shorthand that people develop when they've spent 30 hours working on the same system. Hassel shook hands with Orthvel. Not a ritual gesture. I could tell from the way both of them did it that it was a spontaneous thing, the acknowledgement between two people who have worked together on something difficult and done it well. I went to the landing pad. Veth Kanara was there. Just her, the rest of the oar speakers were back with the broader group, but she had come to the foot of the ramp herself. I looked at her. She said in her precise and careful standard, 11 days. Yes, I said. We sent the beacon because it was the mechanism, because the Concordat structure said that the beacon would bring a response. We did not. We had accommodated ourselves to the possibility that the response would not come in time, or that it would not come at all. She paused. And then it came. Late, I said. Not too late, she said. I looked at her for a moment. Take care of Orthvel, I said. He's good. I know, she said. I always have. There was, I think, something she wanted to say in her own language, the kind of thing that doesn't translate and that she knew didn't translate, and so she didn't try. She stood at the foot of the ramp with her secondary arms folded in the calm posture, and she looked at me, and I nodded, and I went up the ramp. I looked back once from the top. She was still standing there. Behind her in the amber morning light, the Sara of Delve Station Korrath were arranged in a loose group on the landing pad, the workers and the administrators and the warriors and the children, copper and burnished red-brown and bright new coin, all of them watching the shuttle, not waving, not speaking, just watching with the attentive stillness of people who are recording something. The ramp closed. The shuttle lifted. From altitude, Delve Station Korrath looked like a gray dish pressed against the pale surface of the moon. The lights in the central hab and the eastern work section were on. The Dorathi Guild freighter was still at the dock. The sky above was a pale amber fading to almost black at zenith. The enforcement vessel was still at 200 kilometers altitude, watching. It had been watching for 13 days now and had done nothing except watch, which was, in the accounting of this situation, exactly what I had calculated. We rendezvoused with the Meridian at 9:41. I filed the amended supply manifest and the departure report and the final update to the Coalition humanitarian case number that had been sitting open for 11 days. And then I went to the forward observation deck with a cup of coffee and looked at the space where Korrath was, which from the Meridian's position was just a faint disk against the star field. The after-action report went into the ESV Operational Archive. It went into the Coalition Humanitarian Registry. It went into the Concordat Commercial Arbitration record 6 months later when the Sarai filed their formal rejection of the Guild proposal, which the arbitration panel ruled in the Sarai's favor by a margin that the Concordat trade press described as decisive. The enforcement vessel left Korrath orbit 8 weeks after we did. The grid repair materials arrived from the supply depot 14 weeks after our visit, shipped through a coalition logistics relay. Once the arbitration filing created a formal Concordat record of the infrastructure situation. The shipment was routed through the ESV logistics registry at Len's suggestion, which meant it was tracked and documented in a way that guild-adjacent logistics channels were not. I know all of this because Veth Kanara sent a message to the Meridian's comm address 6 months after the visit, care of the ESV registry. It was in Concordat standard, brief and precise in her way. She said the grid was fully restored. She said Dareth Show had returned to work. She said Orth Vel had been formally reclassified from Delvkin to technical administration, which was a caste crossing that she noted had required or Speaker Council approval and had received it unanimously. She said the arbitration had concluded. At the end of the message, she said, "We hear your ship is still in this sector." I sent back a short acknowledgement. Confirmed position, confirmed sector assignment through the next quarter. Standard logistics update. She sent back 2 words in Sarai, which I had Len translate. It took Len about 20 minutes to find a Sarai language resource that covered the phrase. It was an old construction, not common in modern Sarai usage, and the translation required some interpretive judgment. Len brought me the translation on a slip of paper, the way she brings things when she's not entirely sure she's got it right, and wants me to see the care she's taken with the uncertainty. The phrase was something like, "The path is known." Len's translation note said, "In old Sarai usage, this phrase was applied to a trail that had been walked before and could be walked again. Not a promise, more like the route exists. If it needs to be traveled, it can be." I looked at that for a while. Then I filed it in the after-action record and went back to work. The log for the Korrath diversion runs to 26 pages. In the ESV operational summary, it occupies 2 lines in the humanitarian assist column under miscellaneous diversions, route, Vethani drift, category, non-combat humanitarian assist, duration, 31 hours surface time, outcome, positive. It was a routine diversion. We were the closest ship, so we turned around. That's all it was. That's exactly what it was.